Greetings, intro students. Hi, this is Leslie, and I'm here to talk about the first few slides in the culture presentation, the slideshow. So what we're going to do is just chat through the first ones, talk about the definition and scope of culture, and then you, with all your spare time and glory, can go through the rest of them and look through subcultures, countercultures, etc., etc. Okay, so first, here's our page right here. And you may notice the picture at the bottom right here. I obviously put that in because, it's kind of cool. But aside from that, I also like it because it humorously illustrates the effects that culture have on shaping our behaviors. So with this man emulating this very sexualized and gendered presentation of domestic womanhood, it, in my opinion, is mocking it and showing us how constructed and kind of ridiculous it is. Because if you didn't look right away and see Jessica Simpson with her Swiffer mop and think, wow, that looks really goofy, I really, using the Swiffer mop myself or my partner or mother or whoever, we've never really looked like that. So, people don't. In fact, I mopped a couple days ago, and I can guarantee you I did not look like that while using my Swiffer mop. Okay, so here we are. Let's go to the next page. Again, there are four big subtopics, and we're only really going to talk today in this video of the first one, which is defining culture and giving it a scope. Okay, the first thing to note about culture is it comes in a bunch of different sizes. So really, anytime you get two or more people together and they start interacting, and some norms about how to interact with one another, how to talk with one another, some of the rituals you come up with, some of the places you go, the things you do, the things that are unacceptable. If you get two or more people together, a culture is going to form. So it's the ways of interacting and talking, behaving with one another. So you can, obviously, there are lots of different ways of having two people together. We can have anything as small as you and your BFF hanging out, and as big as a global culture if you think on a global scale we all have enough in common with language and rituals and such to actually have an overarching culture. Regardless, I think most of us can agree that we do have a mainstream American culture. So mainstream American culture, I'm going to talk about that in just a second, what we think that is, what are some of the components of it. But right now I just want us to think about almost 320 million people who are in the US. And we have enough in common so that we can say there is an American culture. So start thinking through what you think that is. But you can whittle that down a little bit from 320 million people and talk about South Dakota culture, which is, I don't know, what, like 800,000 people. So with our 800,000 people, I would say South Dakota has its own subculture beneath a mainstream American culture, right? It's unique enough to be different than some other states' cultures. So I moved here a while ago from Southern California, and in case you're wondering, I can tell you, South Dakota, overall, the culture here in West River, if that's where I live, I assume that's where y'all live, is a little bit different than LA, which is where I'm from. So the ways of interacting with people, the ways of talking with people, the ways of dressing, the ways of doing hair, there are so many subtle ways of living and interacting differently. And so that's one example of a smaller scale culture. You could whittle that down even more and talk about Black Hills State culture. So we could talk about how, if, let's say, you've gone to Black Hills State, you've gone to Western Dakota Tech, or you've gone to USD, you may find differences in the relationship between students and instructors, in how the campus facilitates particular types of interactions, or the emphasis on different types of learning and knowing. So you may find differences. Black Hills State culture is not going to be the same as USD or WDT or the small community college that I worked at in LA. It's different. I mean, you can even go smaller than that and talk about how our class is its own culture unto itself. So we may interact with one another differently and have a different relationship with the material. We may have different types of assignments, therefore that shapes how we learn. That is going to be different than some of your other classes. So your sociology, your intro to sociology class, first of all, may be different if you're taking another sociology class, like let's say you're taking race and ethnic relations. It's going to be different than that one. Your sociology class is also going to be very different than your math class or your physics lab. It's going to be a very different way of interacting. So even as small as that, which is not a lot of people. And then there's yogurt culture, which really isn't a sociological topic, but it did give me an excuse to post a picture of yummy, yummy yogurt. You're welcome. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. No, stop staring at the yogurt. Anyway, this is what I want you to do. I want you to think for a second what culture means. I've obviously talked a lot about it. I've given you a few hints. Think about it though. What is culture for real? Take a few seconds. Think about how you would define it. Okay, did you really think about it or did you just drift off? I believe in you. I think you really thought about it. So we're going to go to on the next slide and I'm going to give you the book definition of culture. And then I'm going to give you a metaphor for culture because I really want you to understand what this is. Excuse me, because a lot of people say culture, the analogy they use to talk about it is culture is like the water to the fish. We are the fish. Culture is the water. It's so much around us, we don't even know it or see it. And in fact, you wouldn't be able to understand what I'm talking about. You wouldn't be able to understand how to click this YouTube video, how to understand the words that I'm using. You wouldn't be able to interpret the inflections in my voice. All of this is culture, ways of communicating with one another, ways of knowing how to do things, etc., etc. All right, so here's the book definition. Big old long definition. So I included 4 pictures that I thought might help illustrate this rather lengthy definition. The first one is movies. And I want you to think, why did Leslie put an example of movies in there? How do those represent culture? And I hope you immediately shouted to the heavens, why, popular culture, of course. And indeed, this is an example of popular culture. Movies not only represent culture and ways of knowing and doing, performing, talking about things, but they also prescribe. Much as we looked at the picture of Jessica Simpson posing in a way no one has ever posed with a Swiffer mop. And we may get some messages about femininity, about sexuality, about sexual availability from that. So media not only reflect, but they help prescribe how we understand culture. In fact, media are one of the most effective ways of transmitting cultural values and traditions and norms, because one movie can reach literally millions of people. That's even better than you on Twitter. So just think it's a very effective way. Okay, the next one is what? A wedding, exactly. And I chose a different type of wedding than you may be accustomed to, because I happen to know that of all the 50 states, South Dakota has the fewest Jews. That's actually true. And so I chose an example of a Jewish wedding, even though you're likely not Jewish. And I say this statistically, if you are, mazel tov. But if you're not, you know, most South Dakotans are not. But you probably still recognize that this is a marriage ceremony because it has enough of the symbols in it for you to be able to interpret it. I mean, maybe you could tell from the kippah, the yarmulke right here, that it was a Jewish, and, you know, from the beard and such. But we have the white dress with the veil, and we have the nice clothing, and it's ceremonial, standing in front of an officiant. You sort of can get the idea that this is a wedding, even though you may not be Jewish. And that's because you are familiar enough with culture and there's enough cultural overlap for you to understand. Music is very cultural. Not only the type of music that we create, but even what we understand as music. So for example, in the West, we're much more melodically inclined, whereas let's say a lot of the slaves who were forcibly brought to the U.S. from Western Africa, a lot of them had an understanding of music as a very rhythmic thing. So beats and rhythm, the longs and the shorts of things, as opposed to the melodies. This is when you combine them together, you get things like jazz, by the way. And jazz is the basis of modern rock and obviously hip hop and country and such. So because of these two different ways of understanding music, we have a whole new thing come out of there. Anyway, and then language itself, just the symbols of language, the words, the inflections, the ways of understanding. You have to learn that. You're not born knowing language, obviously. You know this because if you went to another country and they're speaking another language, you'd be like, yeah. All right. Here's my very profound metaphor of culture, just to try to break it down for you. Okay, so here we are. We're just a bunch of bricks. Another brick in the wall? Not yet, my friend. Here we are. Notice we're not doing anything. We're not forming anything. We're not useful. We're not keeping things in or keeping things out. We're just bricks. Really not communicating with one another. But oh, if only we could have another or we could have a way of communicating with one another, language that we could use that could help us understand one another, ways of moving, rituals that we perform, meanings that we ascribe to things. If only we had all of that in common. Why, we do. If we're bricks, culture is the mortar. So you slather some on each brick. So you have ways of talking about things, you have body language, you have rituals, you have norms, you have expectations, you have all of this stuff. And now we can understand one another and make a nice, beautiful structure and work together. This is obviously a very functionalist metaphor, which you now know because, we went through functionalism and the other theories. So we now have this structure that we've created. So we're not just a pile of bricks. We are, in fact, working together to keep ourselves in and others out. All right. Now I want you to think through this. This is going to be our last slide. Stop cheering. But I really do want you to think through this. Is there a mainstream American culture? If you're like, yeah, I know what it is to be an American. What is it? Tell me. Or think through it. Okay, so if you do indeed say, yeah, of course I know what it means to be American, and if I were to go to another country and someone said, what does it mean to be American? I would say these things. So if you were to go to Washington, New Mexico, South Carolina, Vermont, Nebraska, South Dakota. We just had a nice little trip there. If you were to do all that and ask everyone there, what does it mean to be American? Do you think you'd get the same responses? I think you would get there would be some variation, but I think overall there would be some overlap too. And we would be able to communicate with one another about what it means to be an American, and there would be a great deal of overlap. And so what are those things? What would the people in Vermont versus Arizona versus Idaho say it means to be American? Because we're talking 320 almost million people and a giant, we're like the third largest country in the world geographically. What does that mean? How do we know what it means to be American when we have that much space and that many people? How do we learn it? And what are those things? What does it mean to be a member of the US and mainstream American culture? And so read through your text. It talks about some things like freedom, individualism, capitalism, nationalism, oh gosh, I don't know, apple pie. And think through how we know these things. All right, have a fabulous